This is Steve Zeltzer with Workweek, and we have covered in the past the whole issue of health and safety protection for workers in the United States and workers around the world in the biotech industry. And this issue is absolutely critical in light of the pandemic and the great dangers, growing dangers in biotech laboratories, which are taking place not just in China, but also in the United States and many other countries. And the issue of biotech safety for biotech workers is not a new issue, and there's been a struggle many years to have protection for biotech safety. But as we know, in the United States, the pharmaceutical companies, big pharma, are really in control of health and safety. And there's a history of biotech workers fighting for health and safety and being retaliated against. So today we're going to be looking at some of this history, some of the issues for biotech workers, and how working people and the public can be protected so that if there is research done, number one, the workers who do it are protected and the public as well. And two, there's proper oversight of the biotech industry. And we'll learn today about some of the issues around fighting for oversight and why there isn't enough investigators, OSHA inspectors, and what's happened with the protection of biotech workers in the United States. And in California, where we are, there are hundreds of thousands of biotech workers, a big industry in California. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first guest, who's Becky McClain. Becky is a molecular biologist, and she was working at Pfizer and discovered that there were some biological leaks at the laboratory and began a long struggle to protect herself and others from these leaks, and was infected and also learned about the lack of protection for workers. So welcome to this program, Becky.
Thank you.
So Becky, you are a survivor of a struggle to protect yourself and other workers at Pfizer at the Groton, Connecticut. There's a laboratory where there's 6,000 workers, and you had a long struggle there to stop a biological leak and to protect yourself. And it seemed you ran into one roadblock after another in the fight to protect yourself and others. So why don't you talk about the lessons of your struggle and why it's important for biotech workers in the United States today?
The lessons of my struggle is that basically biotech workers have no health and safety rights to even institute a laboratory safety committee within their own department. If they raise safety issues, the company is not legally bound to address them. And if you go to OSHA, the OSHA has been captured, you get no response, or well, you get your case thrown out. I don't want to go into all the details because I think my case, I've spoken about my case a lot in the past years, but I truly believe there's no solution unless workers unionize and fight for their rights. It's going to be a big struggle, but there's no protections for exposures. If you get exposed and you become ill, you have no rights to find out what you were exposed to so you can get medical care. I found that trade secrets supersedes my right to get that information, even though they egregiously exposed me and made me ill. So it's so encompassing, the lack of workers' rights, that we're going to have to biotech workers will have to unionize to be able to get their rights.
And you went to OSHA. What was your experience with OSHA? Because OSHA is supposed to be an agency organized by the federal government, supported financially by the federal government to protect workers in all industries. And they apparently did not even investigate your laboratory.
No, and I had credible, documented egregious safety issues from several scientists, not just myself, basically they ignored it. And after several written requests and verbal requests, they never went in to inspect. And that's even after reporting injuries that were documented. So I don't think workers can really trust OSHA at this time. The agency appears to be captured. So that's that. That's it.
Well, one of the things you did learn, and you talked to David Michaels, and he admitted to you that they're not even inspectors who are knowledgeable about the dangers of biotech releases at biotech laboratories. I mean, how could that be in the United States that the agency, which is responsible for health and safety, doesn't have any capacity really to even send inspectors in to find out what is going on if there's a biological release? I mean, one of the issues going on in China, how there was this potential biotech release there. China has admitted they also had biotech releases at the Wuhan laboratory prior to the COVID. But I mean, if you can't even get investigators who have the training, who have the professionalism to investigate what's going on, it seems like that's a serious health and safety danger to the American people and to biotech workers.
Yes, my investigator, I believe she was a military police officer or something of that sort. She had no biological background. Trying to explain to her the functions of the genetically engineered viruses that were being made and the gains of functions that they were manipulating these viruses with was very difficult because she was a layperson. But in general, it's not that difficult. It shouldn't be that difficult for OSHA to understand. Here's a genetically engineered virus that can infect a person, and they should be able to bring someone in there and look at the situation. Now, if she would have gone in and inspected like she said she was going to do, you're right. She would not have the background to understand what was going on. And even when I went to the state agency, the investigator of the state agency had a biology background, but he didn't have molecular biology background. So it's very difficult for someone without expertise to go in and really inspect the labs. OSHA could make a deal with NIH if there was a problem. They could call NIH and say, give me a person that had some expertise, so they could collaborate with someone, but they don't. I don't know if they do it on purpose, that the investigators don't understand the science behind what they're investigating, or if they just don't have the resources for an OSHA hire. But again, intercross connections between agencies, they could probably, my assumption is they could get someone from NIH with that expertise, but they don't do that.
So our next panelist is Adam Finkel. He's a science doctorate, and he was with OSHA. He's a professor of environmental and occupational health at the UMDNJ School of Public Health. And he actually took up a struggle in OSHA to make sure that OSHA was doing its job, and ran into some roadblocks there. So Adam, can you talk about your experience and what you think the critical issues are for biotech workers and the public at this point?
So my case, by the way, first of all, I left UMDNJ about 15 years ago. I'm at University of Michigan School of Public Health. So my case actually, I think, preceded Becky's by a few years. I inadvertently became a whistleblower as I was the chief official for OSHA in the Rocky Mountain area, one of the 10 regional administrators. And it's a different issue, didn't involve biotech at all, but I was concerned about beryllium dust in the workplace and the lack of protections for OSHA's own inspectors, who were, many of whom were exposed to beryllium dust in the course of their job. And at that time, it was the George W. Bush administration, and my boss, John Henshaw, was not interested in providing medical testing for our own inspectors. A couple $100 blood test to see which of them were partly down the medical pathway towards chronic beryllium disease, which is grave lung disease. So I complained to the press about it, and then I went through the same issues that Becky did, trying to deal with an agency that is not only supposed to be protecting health and safety for workers, but is the arm of the federal government that adjudicates all whistleblower complaints, not only in health and safety, but in the EPA cases, pipeline safety, Enron, financial accounting, airport safety. All the whistleblowing that goes on inside the government is supposed to be inside the government and private sector employees supposed to be adjudicated by OSHA. Well, I discovered that the agency has a ingrained, deep-set animus against dissenters, both internally and across the country. So I could not get a fair hearing in my own agency. I ultimately had to get a lawyer and sue, and I won a big settlement because we discovered emails internally saying things like, send me to Denver where Adam is with a shotgun and I'll take care of your problem. So, and I know Becky's case, and I wrote an affidavit on her side many years ago. It's too common. David Michaels, my friend and successor running OSHA, I think was not as helpful as he should have been during his time there, and said some reasonable and sympathetic, empathetic things to Becky afterwards. I would say the only thing I didn't really agree with, just one word choice of Becky's, is captured. I don't think it's necessarily regulatory capture and industry influence because it's so across the board. OSHA is outgunned, understaffed, depleted, demoralized. And the metaphor I always use, I could find it and share my screen, but I have a picture from a psychology textbook of a horse that is tied with a thin plastic rope to a very lightweight plastic chair in the middle of the yard. And the horse doesn't try to run and drag this 1 ounce plastic chair because it's been trained that it's helpless, and that if there's a rope around its neck, it can't move. And that's OSHA's been around for 52 years, and somewhere along the way, it got the message that if it sort of stuck its head above the ground, it would get lopped off. And so almost across the board, there is a lack of ambition and boldness and real desire to take risks and do what the statute says. I guess my other, again, one word choice of Becky's, just one word here and there, is rights. Becky and all the other workers do have rights. The federal law, the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970, confers those rights. The problem is that the rights are being violated hourly, daily, weekly, and the agency is supposed to protect workers is not empowered, or has not empowered itself to defend those rights. So the rights exist; they're just not they're not real. Unionization, I think, is not the answer. Workers in unionized plants don't fare much better in the system that we have now. I think a big part of it is, well, two things I would cite. One is a general 52-year-long emphasis on safety, and I think when Becky said safety, I don't know her former establishment, but OSHA is better relatively with ladders and electrocutions and amputations and construction accidents than it is with chronic exposures and disease. It's always been that way. They say that 80% of their work is safety and 20% is health, and that's a gross exaggeration. It's about 97% of the resources go to safety and about 3% go to health. Fewer and fewer inspections are being done where samples of any chemical, biological, radioactive agent are being measured. And just as one example, I think the OSHA law, if it was interpreted properly, would allow for meaningful financial penalties for chronic overexposures, like the EPA law does. EPA can fine a company per day of violation. So if they discover something that's been leaking for a year, it's 365 times the daily penalty. OSHA has never sought to do that. even though if you show up and you realize in the, through the analytical work or through the record keeping that it's this situation's persisted for weeks or months or years, that, and each day is a violation, but they only choose to assess one day, and that's usually $10,000 or $12,000, which is rounding error to a medium company, and it's completely trivial to a Pfizer-sized company. And then the last thing I'll say is I think there's a particular problem. Becky is right that anything involving specialized brand new knowledge or nanotechnology or synthetic biology or virology with 1,800 inspectors, and that number is shrinking every year and not being replenished. It's very hard to have people, even one or two nationwide, with that experience. She's right that OSHA should be much more willing to cooperate with other agencies, but it's part of a general problem with the medical. I guess to the extent I would buy into any kind of a big dark force, it's the medical, pharmaceutical, physician, hospital establishment. OSHA's always had a lot of opposition from that, and I'm sensitized to it this week. I was one of like 900 experts who signed a letter to the CDC yesterday that went out complaining about the new guidance for healthcare workers with respect to COVID. And I'm a fan of CDC, but they've lost their way with respect to infectious disease. And they're once again recommending surgical masks for healthcare workers, which are known for decades to be relatively ineffective, whereas N95s and better are much more effective for the same price, the same comfort level. And it's a tragedy that the AMA and the hospital infection control associations, they actually helped kill our tuberculosis standard in 1997. And if we had managed to promulgate that, we'd have had a 23-year head start before COVID, stockpiling N95s, because they would have been de rigueur in hospitals, homeless shelters, drug treatment, hospice, all kinds of healthcare facilities where TB is endemic. And we screwed up internally. I had a boss who was not interested in pushing that through, but it was the medical establishment that didn't want to be told what kind of mask to wear, and it's persistent to this day. So not a happy story, but and I really don't have anything constructive, forward-looking to say. I think OSHA and EPA and the other agencies are in a death spiral right now because of the way the country has turned and the mythology about regulation, job-killing regulations, one of the biggest hoaxes perpetrated on the country. And it's going to be a while before we even get back to the so-called golden days of the 70s and 80s, which was before my time, but I don't think they were so great. But we've stepped into a hole with respect to those 2 decades.
Thank you, Adam. One of the issues is that although this is an issue for working people and particularly unionized and unorganized workers, it hasn't been taken up. I know when there was explosion in Texas, for example, there were big chemical explosions there, and whole communities were wrecked. A Texas federal OSHA, it's a federal OSHA program. There are 98 inspectors in all of Texas for these workers. When President Obama went there, he didn't mention the fact that the federal government is responsible for the OSHA program in Texas. So you have, I think, a denial. In California, there are less than 200 inspectors. And one of the reasons for the spread of COVID and the lack of protection was you didn't have inspectors making sure that, for example, notification of what to do with COVID was done in different languages. That the Tesla plant was allowed to operate when there was a shelter-in-place order in Alameda County. It was like a vector. People would work in the plant, and they would get on buses going to Central Valley, bringing the virus to the Central Valley. It seems that we have now a growing situation, even with COVID growing again, and yet there are no figures. Masks are not required in the airlines. If you go on a plane, everyone's unmasked. I mean, it seems like a death spiral, not just for biotech workers, but for the people of the United States. And I think that the failure of the unions to take this up nationally, and they do have the ability to take issues up nationally, is striking, because it's a public issue. It's not just a union issue, it's a public issue. And unfortunately, I don't think the SEIU, these national unions, are making it an issue at all. I mean, they could get some legislators to have hearings. When there were hearings on the biotech releases in China, for example, which the Republicans did in Congress, there was no call there to talk about biotech laboratories in the United States. We're talking about China, but what about the United States?
If I could just say one more thing, Steve, I completely agree. One of the things I'm trying to work on out of Michigan is the environmental justice movement. So that's long overdue. It's great that the Biden administration is planning to spend billions of dollars trying to find those communities that are most disproportionately affected by pollution, highly correlated with race and income and ethnicity. However, across the board, we all spend half our waking hours at work. And the biggest injustices by factors of tens of thousands affect workers. And if we go to the communities that are relatively the most exposed, we are probably going to miss the communities where the people in those census tracts go to the jobs that are most dangerous. And if you work in a dirty job, you are 10,000-fold more likely to get chronic disease than if you live in the dirtiest community on the fence line. So if we can't construe justice as being occupational first, environmental close second, maybe distant second, and we're not doing any of that. It's all about measurements at the fence line. Again, I support it, but it's missing, it's the tiniest tip of an iceberg.
And Becky, you had a health problem. You were infected at the Pfizer lab. So even healthcare is an issue. I know that workers are getting infected in biotech labs, but you can't find that out. A lot of that is secret information. As long as you have private control of the healthcare system and workers' comp, it's all undercover. It's all private, and the correlation between disease and environment is very much hidden. I mean, if you go to a hospital and you have a disease, cancer or diseases caused by certain environmental problems, they don't ask you. There's no survey of where you lived. People who live next to refineries. I know I interviewed a woman who had 5 different kinds of cancer. She lived, her school was right next to an oil refinery in Rodeo. And, as a result of that, Conoco, she probably had gotten the cancer, but they don't even ask that at your hospital, because of the structure of the medical system is not to provide information about where people are getting diseases and the correlation of that, because it might show liability of the corporations that are doing the toxic, have toxic dangers in their factories. I mean, Becky, can you talk about, you brought it up in the community. I know one of the reasons you may have won your lawsuit was people found out that the biological material was being released into the air, into the community.
That did happen, but I believe why we're not getting a lot of information about exposed biotech workers, because they have to sign gag orders. A woman called me up, working from Pfizer, exposed, sick. She said she couldn't talk about it. She was frightened. They make them sign gag orders. They can't talk about it. And it's not released to the public. Now, too bad Sam Husseini didn't make it here, because Allison Young just published what he was working on, about releases from biolabs. Allison Young just published a book called Pandora's Gamble. And it shows that we have a major biosafety issue in the United States. And this has been happening for a while. And I'm glad she put it all together into a book. I don't know how popular the book is, but I think it's significant to note that. But the rights of workers and their constant lack of freedom of speech because of forced gag orders on them when they're sick and they're scared that's why I don't know. I think a union might be able to stop that. The other thing about unionization, I don't know. I've never been in a union. I'm just like, I don't know what else to think. At least they could get a safety committee, right? I mean, we were not allowed to have a safety committee. Our committee was silenced when they started bringing up safety issues, and then they wouldn't address them. And then it was, we couldn't form an adequate safety committee to get our safety issues addressed. So maybe a union could, at least could do that. I don't know. I don't know. Adam, are you familiar that biotech workers just are trying to organize now? July the 7th, they at MIT and Harvard, they're trying to unionize the biotech workers. I don't know what issues. I think the majority of issues might be their salaries and other things. But even them, I don't think they understand the issues of laboratory safety, because again, their coworkers are silenced and they don't know how bad it is. It could be.
Right.
So,
No, I don't follow that closely, but obviously there are pockets of activity in workers voting to unionize, all the Starbucks issues and a couple of the Amazon plants and grad students around the country in different places. I think that's all good. I mean, I didn't mean to suggest that being unionized doesn't help, because it certainly does. Although Steve is right, there, just like OSHA is understaffed, they're usually, the AFL has had one person on health and safety. And when Peg Seminaro retired, Becky Rindell came in, but it's one person. The other thing I meant to say, I'll just say real briefly, because it dovetails with what Becky said. The other part of the problem, of course, is information. And you talked about trade secrets, anything that has to do with material safety data sheets and labels is another huge problem. I do a lot of expert witness work now, most of which is failure to warn by upstream manufacturers. They produce these useless, inadequate data sheets that the customers and the employees of the customers, who are often at higher risk than the manufacturers. The manufacturers make things in closed systems, send them downstream where they could be used in any kind of open system. And the data sheets are terrible. And when OSHA says they frequently cite the hazard communication standard, they're citing employers for not having the data sheets, but they never in 50 years have seriously gone after the inaccuracies in the data sheets themselves. And so for decades, I do a lot of work in popcorn lung, diacetyl, and these data sheets have not disclosed the obvious causal connection between the agent and a couple of grave lung diseases. And finally they are, but a lot of these exposures in the, say, 2002 to 2010 period were based on failure to warn. And you can't have informed consent if you go find your data sheet that says warning irritant, and you feel like, well, if I'm not getting acute irritation, I must be okay.
Well, there are two issues I think that are also involved in this thing, and that is getting publicity out to the public and about the dangers. Unfortunately, the drug companies and the Hospital Association are major funders of television and the media. So, for example, in the case of Becky's struggle with Pfizer, I doubt that CBS and major companies which take ads from Pfizer want to have a program about what Pfizer is doing as far as the protection of the scientists at Pfizer. And I think that's if people are informed through the media, and most of the major media is corporate controlled, they're not going to get this information out. In fact, it was the Hartford Courant that had the story. I think there was one story in Associated Press. It was a national story, of course, and it's the most well-known case of a biotech worker getting infected, fighting back, and a whistleblower around OSHA, and it didn't get the kind of national publicity that it should have gotten for people in this country. So I think that's another aspect. And the other thing is the Democratic Party, which runs with the Republicans, the US government. And the Democrats take money from the drug companies. They take money from the Hospital Association. So there are real reasons, I think, systemic reasons that the agencies are not doing what they should be doing. Daryl Whitman, who was a OSHA inspector and investigator, found that out when he tried to do some investigations, and he was told by his boss not to file a merit report on toxic dump sites like Hunters Point Shipyard in the Bay Area, where workers and community people were getting contaminated from this radioactive dump site in Treasure Island. So over decades, people have been contaminated, they've been sickened, and the health department of San Francisco doesn't even do a study on what is happening with people who live on these toxic dump sites. And I think that's another whole issue that you were referring to, Adam. And that is these toxic dump sites, areas that are highly dangerous environmentally, and yet the people who live in them or work in them are not really being protected. We have also the case in Ohio now, East Palestine. We're going to have a program on a further program in Labor Fest about it. It is a toxic dump site, and yet people have not only not been bought out because the place is still contaminated, but also they haven't been provided health care, which they could provide. The U.S. government could declare it as an emergency health zone, and they could be allowed to get federal health care in that kind of zone. So it's another example of where you have a catastrophic environmental disaster, and yet the federal government even refused to provide health care for these people, which is allowed under the law, I think.
Yeah, and let alone healthcare, medical monitoring. The court system is terrible and getting worse. And I've done some cases where judges just don't understand, and they say, well, you can't get medical monitoring because you're not sick yet. And of course, the whole point of medical monitoring is to detect disease early. Look, there's no more obvious, even though it's 20 plus years ago, no more obvious failure that will happen the next time because we didn't learn anything from it than 9/11. And we had Christy Todd Whitman at EPA, my former boss, John Henshaw at OSHA, and Rudy Giuliani all saying the same thing, which is everything's fine. And I supported the idea for the first 72 hours. We sent a lot of our inspectors from the Denver Rocky Mountain region to the pile right away. We sent about a third of our people there because they wanted to go. My deputy had worked as an iron worker building the trade center, and he really wanted to go back and work on the operation. And I was obviously, completely supportive of, for the first 72 hours when there may have been live bodies to be found, rush in there and do your job. But at that point, it became a cleanup operation. And for an entire year, people didn't wear respirators on the pile. And, because Whitman and Henshaw and Giuliani were not talking about the dangers. And I had a friend who was an inspector in our region who believed that his incredibly aggressive cancer was accelerated by his exposure on the pile, and he died a year or two later, along with many, many others. And about the Jon Stewart story, and finally getting after the fact compensation. But Giuliani is of course a national disgrace. But I think Christy Todd Whitman is now kind of the voice of moderation, and people don't remember her role in that.
And I mean, it seems both of you think it's getting worse, but there is a revival of the labor movement. And I mean, this heat wave, for example, is a cataclysmic thing for workers who have to work outside, roofers, construction workers. And it's an issue in the UPS struggle, the Teamsters having air conditioning, which it seems like in this day of age, having to fight. We can land something in Mars, investigate what's going on Mars, but we can't have air conditioning in trucks that get 140 degrees. I mean, it really is atrocious. Just the priority and the prioritization of worker health and safety is really an afterthought and is not really being taken care of. So I think, well, one of the issues that has to be addressed, though, is why are there less than 2,000 inspectors for 130 million workers in the United States? Number one. And number two, why is there no inspectors for biotech? And David Michaels admitted that they didn't have professionals to inspect in biotech. With these new industries, nanotech, you would think that it should be required that for new technologies that there be inspectors who are trained and understand the dangers of these new technologies. Yet it's not a priority. It's not in the budget. And even though David Michaels was aware of that, he did not make that a national issue. He did say in hearings that there were no people. I mean, he said to Becky that they didn't have trained people, but it wasn't. He didn't make it a national issue. Maybe he was afraid of his job, because that might have gotten him fired. But the fact of the matter is, you have to make noise to get action, and you have to publicize what the issues are so people understand the dangers and the necessary requirements. So I think that's another political obstacle. If people are not public about it, if they don't go public about it, then it's a real problem.
But free speech is really under attack right now. I thought it was before COVID. And then if you agree or not, your position about the vaccine, the censorship to me is indicative that we are in big trouble. I thought it was only on workers. Now they're coming after the public for censoring the public for medical information. So we are, I just don't know. I'm flabbergasted about everything about free speech, how it's come down now on even the public.
Well, I mean, one of the issues of the vaccine, and this connects to the biotech industry, is that Pfizer was actually financing studies on the effect of their vaccines for the federal government. So you have, I mean, a pharmaceutical company paying for tests about the product that they're producing for people of the United States and around the world. It would seem to be a conflict of interest to have the biotech industry involved in making studies about whether or not some kind of vaccine is a danger or it works. And the other thing is that they limit the liability of these drug companies with the use of vaccines.
Are you saying, Steve, that you don't believe that the company that's producing the vaccine should have a right to have 100% oversight on their studies, right? I mean, that's when I went to look at the studies on the CDC website, they were all Pfizer run studies. There's three links I looked. Now there could have been more, I mean, later on, but what I saw was all Pfizer run controlled studies. That's not adequate. To me, anyway, it wasn't adequate. I mean, is that what your point you're making, is that the study should be under a different jurisdiction other than the
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you have a drug maker who wants a revenue stream, more vaccines, more drugs being distributed, and then they're doing the study about the danger of these drugs or the use of these drugs, you're going to have a conflict of interest. They don't want studies saying that you may get sick from the vaccine. I mean, they limit the liability of people who get sick from the vaccine. They've limited the liability, so they're not even responsible if people get sick from the vaccines. But I think this conflict of interest is systemic again to protect people in the United States. And the other issue is medical schools. I mean, a lot of medical schools now are driven by making money from drug companies. In fact, doctors, and I know this is the case at University of California in San Francisco, head of departments actually are investing in drugs, their own drugs. In fact, there was a case at Davis where they were testing cadavers using some of the drugs that they wanted to market. So here you have a situation at a medical school where you should have an objective scientific professional staff, and yet the managers, the heads of these departments are actually investors in the drug industry, which is very shocking thing. I mean, medical schools and doctors, the whole medical system has been captured by these people who want to make money in drugs, pushing drugs. And again, this is I think the real systematic takeover of our society by the drug companies and the hospital association. And that's one of the reasons we have this obstacle, this impediment. And I think we have to address that. It's not really being addressed.
Right. I want to make a comment that Adam said about medical testing on workers. Now that's unique to it's different for biotech workers. Now, if you're working in a BL3 lab or a BL4 lab, yes, you can get pre-screened because you'll be working on an organism like Ebola or coronavirus. But if you're working in a BL2 lab, genetically engineered viruses, you can't really screen for those because they're always being genetically engineered and changed. And some of them, if you're exposed, it might not necessarily show up in a blood test. So biotech workers are in a much more vulnerable position regarding illness and exposure and proving it. Most of the biotech workers are kicked to the curb. Steve, you know that. I mean, injured injured workers that have illnesses are kicked to the curb. But anyway, I do think the biotech industry is unique in the sense that you really can't pre-screen, medical screen, unless you're working with a specific organism, which most of us don't do. You work with a variety of organisms.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was talking earlier about a somewhat different issue, which is, you know, post-exposure monitoring in the workplace, but also in the communities, and that's a fault of the court system. Look, I'm not sure if we agree about in hindsight about the development of the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine and the safety and the efficacy. I do think that, I mean, there certainly is a conflict of interest problem but I think it's more a quality control problem. I think you do want the companies that make the profits, you know, being responsible for paying for the studies. What we don't have is an independent way to quality control the results of those studies. I'm not as upset about, you know, the studies being under the purview of the manufacturer. It's that, you know, we have to have you know, more than the amount spent on the study spent to validate the studies, and then to have committees of people voting on the costs, you know, the risks and benefits, and making these hard calls when it's not 14-0, because again, the conflicts of interest on the panels are so terrible. But again, I just want to come back to the problem. I know we're talking about one industry, but I just don't think that there's a specific dark force involved in biotech that isn't pervasive everywhere else. OSHA and EPA and the other agencies are getting worse and worse across the board, and some of it's regulatory capture, but some of it is just the direction that the country is taking. You know, starve the beast and not allow the public sector to do its job. So OSHA is not going to take on big pharma, but they're not going to take on the NFL with brain disease in football. They're having look. David Michaels was there for 8 years. Brilliant person, heart's exactly in the right place, and he accomplished a few things. But against hazards, he spent a lot of his time getting a silicosis standard out, a hazard that was written about by Pliny the Elder in like 100 BC. So catching up to getting silica reduced in the workplace is an OSHA priority. But, you know, nanotechnology, you know, is only 20 years old, not 2,500 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So the unfinished business when the agency started is still almost as long as the agenda, you know, was in 1970, because of that we're just not putting resources into it. EPA is 20 times bigger in budget and 20 times more people, and I think they're about the right size. OSHA should be similarly sized, because way more human carnage comes out of the workplace than out of the general environment.
And of course, we're going to have a program on EPA and what's going on with these toxic dump sites. For example, at Apple had some office spaces on a Superfund site in Sunnyvale, California, and they didn't properly inform people, contaminated. And then Apple hired Lisa Jackson to be in charge of environmental protection at Apple. So, I mean, here you have the head of the agency, the EPA, working for Apple, which is supposed to be doing oversight, and the direct connection between the US government top officials and Apple. You're going to have a problem. And a whistleblower was Ashley Govic was actually fired for saying that it had to be inspected. EPA needed to do inspections, as well as OSHA and others. So she was targeted and fired. She was an Apple senior engineer, so or engineering manager. So I think that this is endemic. I think it's systemic, and I think that it's important that the public be aware of this. And I think that the other thing that people don't believe the government. A lot of people don't believe the government, and this is one of the reasons, because government agencies, which are supposed to be protecting people are non-existent. I know that workers are afraid, even in union jobs, to complain about health and safety for fear of being retaliated against. It's supposed to be illegal to fire workers for making health and safety complaints. It happens all the time, both union and non-union. And that's a serious thing. If people are afraid to protect their health and safety on the job, where are we?
Why do you think that unions aren't standing up for union members when they're being retaliated against? Or they just don't have the funds to do it, or they
I
don't have the
think they don't
resources?
want to fight. They don't want to fight management. That's what it amounts to. In other words, to fight it's like in your case. I mean, you didn't have a union, but they didn't want to spend money on fixing the biological cabinet. I mean, unions are not going to war with their managers and companies over health and safety, over protection. I mean, I've interviewed workers at nuclear processing plants, pellet plants, where workers get sick. The unions are not, they're afraid their jobs are going to leave. And it really means a political fight.
Well, wonder, in regards to biological safety and experiencing the COVID horrible pandemic, I just lost my train of thought. But don't you think the public would now be more concerned about biological safety? And could we look at unionization different in the sense that perhaps community organizers, not union organizers, but community people that get together, could work with unions to make sure that whistleblowers protections are happening within the workplace and the unions can help the community? I think we need a whole different a theory about how we set up unions. And if we could somehow at least connect them to public groups that would support them, that might help. I don't know. I just don't know.
Yeah, there are some fledgling moves in this area. There's a group called the Blue Green Alliance that's doing work like that. I know there are a lot of local groups around the country that are mimicking that. But I also think we should have had we needed structural change in government from the beginning. Nixon did the right thing by creating two agencies, but either cleverly or just by inertia, he created EPA and OSHA in the same year, put them at opposite ends of the city with different statutes, different congressional committees. I think there ought to be an agency either separate from the two of them or located in one of the two that does health, health to the communities and the workers caused by exposures. The best way, the cheapest and most efficient way to protect communities from toxic exposures is to clean up workplaces because that's where they emanate from, substitute or engineer or whatever. We don't have that. And then in the whistleblower area, it's long past time to get the whistleblower program out of OSHA. They're again totally overwhelmed, and they should never have been given 17 other statutes by Congress over the last 50 years that they had to administer on top of the OSHA Act. And so a separate independent agency that dealt with the impartial adjudication of retaliation claims across the board, both public and private sector, would be great. But that's never going to happen. I mean, the people championing whistleblower protection are a couple of NGOs like Peer and Gap that I've dealt with. I was on the boards of one of them for a while. They're corrupt, frankly. They're in it for the money. They're in it for the reputational jollies. And people like Chuck Grassley, a completely toxic, useless, doddering old senator. He's like the whistleblower guy in the Senate, and he just talks a good game, but it's never helped anybody.
There was rumors going around in some of my circles of activism that the companies want to get at the table to have a whistleblower law because they can beat you at a whistleblower law. They think that they can't take them on. Go ahead, write a whistleblower law.
But I mean, there should be criminal penalties for retaliating against workers for raising health and safety issues. Basically, there's no prosecution. If somebody dies, in some cases, the district attorney will prosecute. But basically, when companies conspire, as Pfizer did, to retaliate against you, these executives should be criminally prosecuted. But we're not going to get that, in my view, with the Democrats or the Republicans.
Or the Republicans.
No,
Yeah.
no, no.
And actually, you know, going to prison for these executives would have some effect if they were shown to be criminally responsible and conspiring. But it's like, look at Amazon. Amazon flagrantly violates health and safety regulations in its warehouses. Workers are harmed and injured, and they get away with it. And they get a slap in the hand, a couple $1,000 fine. Workers are killed. There's no prosecution of these corporation executives personally. And I think that that's a political problem that we're in, that the Democrats and Republicans are both corporate parties.
Mhm.
Take money from the drug companies. They take money from the polluters. And are they going to bite the hand that feeds them? That's a real question. And it raised the question of a Labor Party or a party of working people that will actually enforce the law, because we're saying, as you said, Adam, you have good laws, they're not being enforced. In California, it's under Gavin Newsom, a Democrat, in a Democratic legislature, that there are no increases in OSHA inspectors. It's under the Democrats that you have toxic dump sites, radioactive dump sites like Hunters Point Shipyard or Downey, California, which are military industrial complexes. Workers are getting sickened, and the developers make money building condos or putting property on these brownfield sites. So I think it's a systemic corruption, and it's a fact that the politicians themselves have been compromised and do not really want to enforce the law, and they don't want to go after the corporations and developers that want to make money from building on toxic dump sites. And that is an ongoing crisis in California. I mean, Ohio, I mean, there's so many dangerous toxic sites around the country. Of course, what happened was they changed the law on Superfund sites to allow developers to come in and promise to clean them up and use them. And of course, the developers really don't clean them up. They want to get them going and develop them, even though they're not cleaned up. And who pays the cost? The people in the communities. But I agree, the need for communities and unions to work together to defend communities, to defend workers, is absolutely critical in raising that.
Yeah, I think it would be good to have some sort of brainstorming session on how that can come to be, or if we would know some people that could, to brainstorm that, because I think we really do need to look at a different solution. And it's critical. I mean, what we experienced with COVID-19, not only the deaths and the economic problem we had, but just the social, backstabbing of your neighbors, and it's just awful. Just the division was just so awful. So yeah, I think there needs to be something done. I wish we could find a solution to it.
I think we all want that, Becky.
Yeah, I'm not optimistic, Steve and Becky. I think, Steve, you're absolutely right about that's a case where we don't have a good law. The whistleblower law does not really provide for criminal prosecution, and it really is a racketeering operation. It should fall under those kinds of standards. But there are laws that would allow for criminal prosecution for willful deaths of workers, and you can count on fingers of one hand the number of executives who have done any prison time in the last 50 years. And David Barstow of the New York Times wrote a great Pulitzer-winning series about that. Like, how many people do you have to kill year after year before somebody's going to take an interest? And he blew the whistle on OSHA and on OSHA's at that time in the early 2000s, willful denial of the problems that some of these. There was a steel plant in New Jersey called McWane, where there was a pattern of fatalities. And of course, there are terrible stories of OSHA rewarding certain companies, putting them in the STAR program and the voluntary protection program, and then you turn around and there's an egregious fatality in one of these places. And again, I think it's more incompetence and underfunding and learned helplessness than corruption. But I also do think in the specific case of healthcare, it is a confluence of forces. I just it's a pet peeve of mine, but this is the industry that has brought us. Obviously, you can't eat a meal anymore in front of your television without hearing these advertisements. It's just all you can hear. But this is the industry that has brought us the degradation of language to the extent. I work a lot in litigation and elsewhere about causality. Can we say this is a known cause or a known association? And we've gone from, this causes that to this is associated with that. And now we have with drugs like Humira, which are known immunosuppressants, the new phraseology is cancers such as lymphomas have happened. Like it's some great mystery that just, they have to use those, they have to say something, and they get away with not saying caused by or associated with. They say they've happened, like, what happens, like it's random. And of course it's not, random. So, but Becky talks about the division. Yeah, we had a lot of division over COVID. I am more in the camp of feeling like mistakes were made out of some good impulses to if there was overreaction and school closures went on too long and restrictions were too severe, which I don't tend to think they were, it was risk aversion in order to prevent a lot worse things from happening. But I still wear a mask. I haven't had COVID yet in 3.5 years, and I don't intend to get it. I'm trying to live my life, but I wear an N95 in indoor public spaces. I don't get sneered at, or people don't challenge me, but you can't put a sign out in front of your house that says all lives matter, that Black Lives Matter, or we have a thing up in Northern New Hampshire, everybody belongs, with different colors, without people stealing them and taking rifle shots at them. So the COVID wars are just a tiny fraction of the division in the country, which is only getting worse. And it's being stoked by, again, I'm just a little uncomfortable because I do think there are forces conspiring against workers. I've seen it up close, but not everything is a conspiracy. And, when you hear RFK Jr., ramble on in kind of incoherency now about everything is some space laser aimed at you, we're never going to get anywhere with that.
I like him.
Well,
I think he talks the truth.
Well, one of the questions is, though, he does talk about the pharmaceutical companies and not trusting them. Then the question is, what is the solution? Because just saying that these companies cannot be trusted is not a solution to a system problem. And this is a system problem. If corporations are making money by selling vaccines and not really providing information, it's a problem with the corporations. And he really doesn't say what the solution is to the conflicts of interest. And there are massive conflicts of interest between the CDC and what happened telling people not to wear masks? You don't need to wear a mask, or that was unbelievable in the midst of a pandemic.
I don't understand that. I don't understand why people don't think masks are. Now I can see the cloth masks, and I think the confusion came because Fauci said, "Don't wear an N95." When he said that, I was like, "What the heck is
right?"
going on?
Yeah. Now that was in a different administration. I blame the boss for that, but yeah, he doesn't deserve 90% of the death threats, but that was an egregious, ridiculous, unscientific, first week epidemiology, first week industrial hygiene.
Right.
But there are no industrial hygienists anymore. I got a certification, and the numbers are diminishing, and the number of people who claim to be knowledgeable is going up. And Steve, you talk about UCSF, and I hear UCSF, and all I can think of is Vinay Prasad, one of the most despicable purveyors of just gross misinformation, and everything has to be a randomized controlled trial. We know that N95s work, like we know that lead aprons reduce cancer in people who are undergoing imaging, because X-rays cause cancer and lead blocks X-rays. We don't need to do a randomized controlled trial of N95s to know that.
Right.
And clowns are out there saying, you know, it's tyranny, and RFK is saying it's tyranny and analogizing it to Nazism. Put your frickin' mask on and protect yourself and protect the person you're coughing on, for God's sake. I mean, it's been 3.5 years.
I keep telling people, you know, you don't want, you know, you're against the vaccine. I could see that it's invasive. You're putting something in that's not 100% tested. But I said, what is the deal with the mask? It's not invasive. You just put it on, it's not that big of a deal.
Well,
When Fauci said, confuse people about the N95, that did it. Once you lose credibility like that, and it confuses just average people that don't know, like you and me, that the N95 mask is what we're going to wear. It confuses people. And then,
it was terrible. And we have not come out of that yet. And you know, you've got people saying the 3 words masks don't work, and some of them are highly trained people like me who mean those 3 words to mean don't put a surgical mask on, don't put a cloth mask on, put on a 75-cent N95. But you've also got people using the same 3 words, and what they mean is, you know, everything that would cover your face is tyranny of the space laser brigade, and you know, don't do any of it because there is no virus and it's just like the flu. And you know, and so how can a layperson understand that when people at the opposite poles of IQ points and ideology are saying the same thing, but they mean the opposite thing?
Yeah.
That's the issue: science versus propaganda. And unfortunately, people in the United States have been propagandized that masks don't really matter. In the planes, you go into a plane today, they don't even ask you if you have COVID. People could be coughing and
oh, sure,
contaminating in a plane, and there's no protection of people who should be protected, who go in a confined area. And of course, the airlines say they've done studies that the airlines are safer because they circulate the air, but the reality, and we did a little investigation, is not the case. If somebody is infected with COVID and coughing in a plane, they can contaminate people in the plane. And of course, when people are told, don't worry, be happy, and they get COVID, and you can't even find out now because they're closing down, you know, public health. Right. So they have to find out from the sewage, and there's no real accountability in public health. That's the destruction of public health in the United States, which is a real concern.
Now, Adam, you mentioned about N95 masks. You know, they didn't even have enough N95 masks for medical personnel, and they knew a pandemic was coming. They knew that 10 years ago, that eventually if it wasn't a biological release, it was going to happen in a different way. And they even had studies of a pandemic happening with coronavirus prior to that happening. Yeah. That's been
absolutely.
They didn't have N95 masks.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you know, we have trillions of gallons of oil in the caverns of Louisiana, but you know, we should have had salt caverns full of N95s. And you know, the Obama administration didn't do it, the Trump administration did it, the George W. Bush administration didn't do it. And again, you know, I was at OSHA in the late 90s. We had a tuberculosis standard ready to go. We had vetted it through the public hearings. We had gone around the country and had hearings in Los Angeles and Atlanta and Chicago. And we fended off the AMA and the Hospital Infection Control Association. And then my new boss, after Robert Reich and Joe Deere left, had the brilliant idea that he was going to do this ergonomic standard, which was needed, but it was not a well-written standard. And he told us to not promulgate anything else, because it was going to distract from his #1 priority, which crashed and burned anyway. And so we lost 25 years because we would have had N95s as the thing that you reach for in healthcare and a lot of ancillary industries. People would have gotten used to them, and we would have had a stockpile. Look, if public health continues to be denigrated as the engine of tyranny, that the public health people are the ones who are trying to take your precious freedom away, our life expectancy will plummet.
That is a very good point.
And it's that rage about no one is the boss of me. I mean, if we really become that country where no one is the boss of me, we will be, putting aside climate change, which is going to get us all anyway. We're going to become a country with among the worst life expectancies in the world, because it is the impulse to protect yourself and the people around you that is what enabled us to live longer. And now all of a sudden that's a bad idea, because protecting yourself and people around you is somehow a plot.
Well, that is driven too. Business industry don't want, health and safety. They don't want OSHA. They don't want protection. And that's why over 1 million people have died in this country. I mean, I think in China, where there's a Tesla plant in Shanghai, they shut it down and they made sure that the workers did not spread the virus. And Musk went along with that because he wants to produce cars in China. Apparently, the Chinese are more important to protecting health and safety than the United States, which allowed his factory to continue operating in the midst of the worst pandemic in over a century. So,
I don't understand how we have 4% of the total world population, and were we highly vaccinated, like 70%, and we had a high mortality rate in this country. I just don't understand how that happened. 16% of all the deaths occurred in the United States, and we are only 4% of the. It's the whole thing was very mysterious, I thought. The thing I have a little issue about the vaccine is the messenger RNA vaccine is any drug you take, there's a dosage. Well, if you're giving a molecule that they don't have genetically controlled dosage from that molecule, because messenger RNA is constantly made, okay? I find that a little bit weird that they're putting a genetically engineered molecule that will express itself until it dies or it degrades, but then you don't have a dosage on that. That's the thing that I'm a little bit troubled about, the safety aspect of the vaccine.
Well, and the efficacy. I mean, I
Yes.
like to believe that was a series of honest errors, honest mistakes. People of goodwill thought that it would be more efficacious than it was. It apparently is pretty efficacious at reducing severity, but not at reducing infection. And that has now been propagandized into you can't trust anything about it, and the whole thing should never have been done. And I think the death toll is largely a function of lack of social distancing and lack of personal protective equipment, and a lot of the deaths, of course, occurred early on in the wave before the vaccines were even available. But now we've decided it's over, even though we know it's not, and we're having difficulty even counting, as Steve said, what the current rates are. I just I'm personally concerned about because I know people who claim, and I visited with them, and they certainly seem to be telling the truth that this long COVID is a real thing, and that a week of flu-like symptoms is not the issue. The issue is what's going to linger. Nobody wants Lyme disease, and nobody wants long COVID. It's just of the things that you can, obviously people don't want a lot of other terrible things that can happen to you, either with exposure or with a genetic time bomb, or just a terrible twist of fate. But you don't want to get bitten by a tick, and you don't want to be coughed on by somebody with COVID.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I want to thank you, Becky and Adam, for this discussion. I think it's important that we had it, and this is an ongoing issue, an ongoing struggle, and working people, the public, need to be protected here and around the world for our future. So thanks for joining us on this discussion on the biotech industry and health and safety, and where we're going as far as our protection of our health and safety.
That was a great ending, Steve. Could I say one more thing?
Sure.
Quickly, I don't know if we're running out of time, but Becky, we've talked in the past, we've never seen each other in person. I've not only seen you on the screen until now, but we are, like it or not, two whistleblowers. And the other trend that really worries me is the rise of the phony whistleblower. And it's going to be harder and harder in society to distinguish people like you and me who did the right thing for the right reasons and were completely correct on the facts, from these people who are getting their instant fame by making stuff up. And I saw it. I'm probably the only person who both supervised OSHA inspectors who were adjudicating whistleblower cases, and then turned against my own agency. But we had people who claimed to be whistleblowers when they really were poor performers who were trying to come up with an immunization against their poor performance. But now we have people at the national level. I'm not going to raise the issue because it's too controversial, but there are people claiming that they have inside information about stuff and that they're being censored or persecuted, and they're just fame hounds. And you're not, and I'm not, but other people are giving the noble cause of dissent a bad name, and that worries me too.
Mm.
Okay, well, thank you, and forward and onward. So thanks for
Thank
joining.
you.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Very good. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.